Hello, I'm Chris Alvarez and welcome to Spacewalk's Money Talks, where we talk about the policy, business, and technology behind space exploration and commercialization. We're on the web at spacewalksmoneytalks.com and on YouTube at Spacewalks Money Talks. Thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Gurbir Singh, author of The Indian Space Program, India's Incredible Journey from the Third World Towards the First. That was published in 2017. And today we're not going to be talking about the book so much as sort of the present state of the Indian space program and anything new that's come up since you published the book. But thank you for speaking with me.
It's great to be here, Chris.
So first, tell me about the Indian space program. What would you like to mention as far as what's currently going on?
Well, it's got very unusual and interesting roots. And because I was born in India, it's one space program that I wasn't aware of in terms of detail. I grew up in the time of Apollo and Yuri Gagarin, so I started to investigate and learn about the Indian space program, and it took me about 6 years with 3 research trips all over India, visiting some of the several key sites of the Indian Space Research Organization, or ISRO. And it was a fascinating journey. So the Indian space program actually started on the 21st of November 1963, and that was the day that a particular event took place, and that event was the launch of a sounding rocket from the southern tip of India, the state of Kerala. It was a sounding rocket, so suborbital, and it was the very first time that something launched from Indian soil went into space, and that is highly regarded as the start of the Indian space program. And it came about because the Indian government in the previous year had put together something that they called the Indian National Committee for Space Research, or INCOSPA, and it was part of the COSPA movement that was established here in Europe and right around the world as well. And from that date onwards, India has developed into something of a major space power, really. It has now about 50 operational satellites in space right now. Navigation, communication, meteorology, and Earth observation. It's also got a spacecraft in orbit around the Moon and an operational spacecraft in the orbit of Mars as well. And later, probably late next year, it's hoping to launch its very first human into space with its own human space program, which was initiated by the Prime Minister last year. There's a whole heap of other science missions. India has a space telescope in Earth orbit, which the Indian press tend to call Hubble, India's equivalent to Hubble Space Telescope. It's quite an impressive instrument, not quite like Hubble, but fascinating and technically a huge achievement nevertheless. And by about next year or the year after, more likely, India hopes to launch a spacecraft to observe the sun, its first solar mission called Aditya-1. And also it has plans to go to Mars with its second Martian mission and the first mission to the planet Venus as well. But in the near term, by the end of this year, although it looks like it's going to slip to early next year, it hopes to go back to the Moon with its second attempt at landing. And if you like, we can talk about the lunar mission that India launched in July last year. The orbiter was successful, but the lunar lander and rover, not so much.
One question I have is, what are the major, are there major companies within India that build launch vehicles or the satellites, or is it mostly working alongside other non-Indian businesses or governments?
Well, in this way, India is really peculiar, and it's unfortunate because it's this area that India hasn't really resolved very well that is the main reason why its launch frequency is so low, and its capacity of spacecraft that it needs to have in orbit is not meeting its own needs. And the frequency of launches, for example, it's never reached double figures, the number of launches in 1 year throughout its history for over 50 years. So the main problem is that currently all of the launches and launches take place are under the auspices of the Indian Space Research Organization, which is a government body. The ISRO has been trying to engage and claiming that it's engaging a larger proportion of the private industry, but that engagement has been very slow and remains slow. And usually the private sector of Indian companies tends to be companies which are small and do work for ISRO under license, developing and implementing the technology that ISRO has developed. In two respects, I suppose two main developments recently is that India has now got companies which will build the satellites for them. The last navigation satellite that was launched by ISRO was built entirely under the auspices of a private sector company, although the relationship there, I suspect, wasn't as independent as ISRO would like to see it, and hopefully it won't be so in the future. And in addition to that, the key launch vehicle that ISRO uses is the PSLV, and that launch vehicle, again, the frequency rate of launches is so low, mainly because ISRO doesn't have the capacity to build so many of them, and engaging independent private sector companies to do that is one of the things that ISRO's target is for this year. So in both satellite or spacecraft manufacture and launch vehicle manufacture, they're hoping to get push that out entirely to the private sector, as well as, I'll just mention one other. As you may have noticed, these great move towards small satellites and small satellite launch vehicles. Electron, for example, has been doing some terrific stuff in New Zealand and the US. And I suppose in part to target that market of small satellites, ISRO has developed something that they call the Small Satellite Launch Vehicle, or SSLV. That is something that from the outset ISRO wants the private sector to build and have a much more frequent launch frequency than anything that they have at the moment.
I get the impression, so I feel like India has a huge amount of intellectual power, a lot of scientists and engineers, and yet the physical capacity to use their capabilities doesn't seem to be there. Is there a frustration among maybe Indian engineers who may go to other countries to use their skills, or how does that dynamic work?
You pointed to something quite important there, actually. India has, whenever you read any papers or presentations to do with India and space, there's this word that keeps popping up: indigenous. India has always been very keen to have this independent space program. And to that effect, what's happened is that over the years, ISRO has become essentially the master of everything to do with space in India. It tends to be the the organization that licenses any private sector companies that may want to develop or work in the space sector. And that has held it back because, unlike in the US and other countries, the way that the space sector, private space sector in India works is that private space companies will only build for ISRO what ISRO has requested using ISRO's intellectual property and the license. And that really frustrates a lot of the private sector companies, which are prevented from innovating and developing their own material and interacting with the larger global space market than just India. So India's been held back because of the absence of the space policy, for example, which a lot of countries are developing right now, and something that's required for private companies in India to develop their own launchers, their own satellites and spacecraft. They have to get permission or a license from ISRO at the moment. In the absence of a national space policy, that will continue to hold back. And that's the consequences of all that, is that a lot of the Indian scientists and engineers, as you said, very talented, end up working for the European Space Agency or indeed NASA or elsewhere, because it's so frustrating to work in that field in India.
Why does ISRO keep such control over the space industry there?
I'm speculating, but I would guess it's just like anybody else who has power and control. Once they have it, very reluctant to let it go. But I think the pressure, not only the commercial pressure within the country, but also from within the government departments and the people of India. ISRO is a terrific organization, very talented, hardworking people there, but they are set in their ways. And I think the way that it's organized in terms of inhibiting the development of the private sector will, in a year or two to come, will have to change significantly for that step change that's required, because ISRO is going to be left way behind. If you've seen this year, like last year, China had the most launches in the world, 35 this year, compared to India, compared to certainly India. India had only 6. And indeed, Russia and America were behind China both this year and last year. So India sees China, because its geographical vicinity, as something to keep up with. So it will have to make substantial changes to make sure that the cadence of launches, for example, increases.
I'm speaking with Gurbir Singh about the Space Agency of India, past, present, and future. You can find him and his podcast at astrotalkuk.org and on Twitter at Gurbir Singh. If you like this podcast, please follow, like, and comment at spacewalksmoneytalks.com, on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, Spacewalks Money Talks, and on Twitter at SpacewalksMT. Now back to the podcast. Is the Indian public very much aware of their space program? Is it well publicized, or is it sort of a cool thing that just a few people kind of keep track of?
It is. India is a very large, has a very large population and a very large young population. And of course, space excites young people in India as it does elsewhere in the world. So there's a great following, huge following. Unfortunately, this is another area that ISRO does not serve well. Its publicity and marketing operations are very poor and very weak. Nothing at all like NASA. If you go to NASA websites, they have YouTube channels, they keep Twitter feeds updated. India, or ISRO, it is making progress. It was late last year, in fact, that they opened a viewing gallery at the primary and indeed only launch port, spaceport in India called Sriharikota, which is on the east coast. And until then, people who wanted to view a launch from India had to just, go around to the nearest public roads. But now there is actually a gallery where people can go and watch. And indeed, India has just announced only a few months ago that they will be building another spaceport, mainly for the small satellite launch vehicles, certainly to start off with. But it's these kinds of mechanisms for engaging the public are very far and few in between. And then one other thing that India announced recently, because they are recognizing these shortcomings, is that they will be opening space museums in cities around the country. Currently, India has just one space museum, and it's inside a ISRO space center, so access to it is very, very limited and restricted. So it's making some headway, but in fact, it was the launch of the 2008 first mission to the moon that India was really doing one of the most successful space exploration missions that would have interested and intrigued the larger population. Just like when my interest in space during the 70s and 80s, I followed NASA and the Pioneer and the Voyager missions, really got me into in space, and of course the Apollo before that. That first mission to the moon certainly had the social media been available as it is now then, would have captured a lot of the attention of the people, of the young people in India then. And indeed, in 2013, when India launched its mission to Mars, that's exactly what happened. The number of people who were attracted to not only understanding what's going on and following it, but also applying for jobs within ISRO shot up. And since then, ISRO has done a job in terms of developing a Facebook presence, Twitter, and a YouTube channel. It is still incredibly weak, given the benefit that it could accrue if it put some more time and effort in there.
Now, this plan to send a person into space, India's plan to do that. I would imagine that should spark widespread interest as well. You know, I don't know how their program is developed or how what the state of it is right now.
Well, it indeed did capture the headlines in August last year when it was announced by the Prime Minister. It's called Gaganyaan, and it's designed to launch. The initial announcement was that it would be a 3-crew spacecraft in Earth orbit for a week, launched by a rocket, Indian-built rocket, from Indian soil. The mission profile was that they would be doing some crew escape launch tests, building the infrastructure, building the capsule itself, the environmental control systems and the navigation and guidance that goes with it, testing the splashdown. They have tested with a couple of suborbital flights, or rather one suborbital flight in 2015, when a mock-up crew vehicle was shot up to about 100 miles and then returned back to a splashdown using parachutes. But prior to that, way back in 2007, India did conduct what they called a spacecraft recovery experiment. And in that experiment, that was the first time that they'd put a spacecraft in orbit. It stayed in orbit for about a week, did some experiments in LEO, and at the end of that, it was deorbited and it splashed down. That was the first time that ISRO recovered something that had been in space. So on the back of that, the ISRO felt that they could get the human spaceflight program, the goal of getting Indians into space by 2022. And currently, I spoke to some of the ISRO representatives at the IAC in Washington, D.C. in October. They say they're on target, and indeed, with a few more in-flight abort tests, they've already conducted pad abort tests, they should be on target for a possible, they want to do a few more in-flight abort tests, and then do some dummy runs without human beings on board, with a view to the earliest by December 2021, maybe get the very first flight in, but the target would be July 2022. They're still on target, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to do that.
And then once that's accomplished, what's the next goal? That's a step towards what afterwards?
Well, so as most countries, India's space program is highly nationalistic in nature, and they're strategically keeping up with their neighbors, in particular in China. But China's way ahead, and the intention of future human spaceflight missions within India. I did ask if India had plans to join NASA on its Artemis project, the return to the moon with the first woman by 2024. ISRO has not made any decisions about that, but I would suspect that if they can, they would like to collaborate on this. I should also mention that although India has developed quite a lot of the critical technology for human spaceflight already, they are still at the very early stages. All of the training, human spaceflight training, is being conducted with a program of collaboration with Russia and Star City in Moscow. And there's some spaceflight medical collaborative work that India is doing with France. So as these develop and gradually grow, I suspect in about 3 or 4 years' time, India will have these kinds of facilities within India and be more capable of supporting collaborative international space missions of human spaceflight. But apart from human spaceflight, there are a few other projects that India has in the pipeline, which I can mention too, if you like.
Sure. But just as an aside, it's interesting that the landing on the moon in '69 was driven by competition between the Soviet Union and the U.S. And now it seems that we have a space race where it's almost a three-way, where you have China and the U.S. are in competition, Russia is in there, and now India is competing with China. So you have a number of players all trying to succeed in various ways in the space arena. So it's kind of fascinating.
That's right. And in fact, this time round, again, your observation's spot on. It is very competitive, and that's what drives, that was what drove the Apollo program in the 1960s, and certainly is doing that now between India and China. But I think in addition to the international competition, there's also now a very real and collaborative environment which didn't exist then. And on top of that, there is this incredibly sophisticated and well-developed private sector program, which you will see probably before the year is out. And this year, there are, I think, about 3 or 4 private sector companies aiming to go to the moon and land on its surface as part of the NASA's commercial lunar exploration program. They are driving towards an environment where you will not only have commercial partners providing some aspects of the lunar mission solution, not only to do with the NASA's Gateway, but also collaboration between various countries. And indeed, on NASA's Gateway, this is the, if you like, the next step after the International Space Station, a space station around lunar orbit. And both Italy and Japan have already committed to collaborating with the US in the Gateway. And I should imagine that within the next few years, India and I really hope China too will come on board and join US. You know, I remember the days of Apollo, when the competition was between the USSR and USA. And then by middle of the 1970s, 1975, there was the Apollo-Soyuz test project, where the famous handshake between Soviet and American astronauts took place in Earth orbit. So previously, they had been competitors, but by 1975, they were working together in space. And I see no reason why China will not also come and join once the Congress changes its laws about China joining NASA and working in space collaboratively.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the lunar missions that you've mentioned.
Yeah, so let's go back to India's second lunar mission, Chandrayaan-2, was launched in July last year, and there was two parts to it. One was a lander and the other an orbiter. And the orbiter, lunar orbiter, was fine. It's still orbiting and returning data. The lander was supposed to have landed on the 7th of September. Didn't unfortunately land successfully, and the ISRO didn't really handle that very well, in my view. They could have kept more of the people, more of the not only India, population of India informed, but also the global community. It did crash. It had a problem with one of the thrusters, one or more of the thrusters, or perhaps the software that were controlling them, and it never did establish contact that they were hoping to. In the wake of that, late last year, a couple of months ago, they made an announcement that they would repeat that experiment, and they would go by December this year back to the moon, but with only a lander and rover. Now, that date, as I indicated earlier, is likely to slip, but they are going to go back to the moon with Chandrayaan-3, lander and rover, probably by about this time next year. That's the most recent, or the earliest of the missions going back to the moon in scope for India. But also India is collaborating with Japan. And that mission, when the date hasn't been fixed yet, but it will be landing on the south pole of the moon with the intention of India providing the lander and Japan providing the rover and the lander. In addition to that, the ISRO is also working on a program with France and NASA for spacecraft, and there are various plans for the private sector in India, but nothing firm on that going back to the moon just yet.
I think is there also a solar mission planned?
Yes, there is. It's called Aditya, and it's going to one of the Lagrangian points, Aditya L1. It's a solar telescope, a solar observatory, and it's been in the pipeline for quite a few years. Initially, it was going to be just an Earth orbiting satellite, but then, given the problems with observing the sun from Earth orbit, half the orbit you can't see the sun. A huge decision was made about 4 or 5 years ago to put this into a Lagrangian orbit from where it would be able to see the sun all the time. And that single shift in the mission profile meant that there was a huge number of additional work, which doesn't necessarily cause delays, and it will need a bigger rocket, which now India has also. India's one of the key developments last year was the operationalization of its GSLV Mark III, which is what India refers to as a heavy lift launch vehicle. Mm-hmm. And to get anything of a substantial mass to Mars or lunar orbit or one of the Lagrangian points, you do need a heavy lift vehicle, and that's what will be used for the solar mission Aditya L1.
Mm-hmm. Now, other nations have both a civilian and a military space program. I would assume India has the same thing, where their military is also pursuing space projects.
Absolutely. You're dead right. Most space programs usually come about because of the military imperative. However, at the outset, India is unusual. It didn't start out that way. Back in the 1960s, India was still, a very recent independent nation. It had become independent only in 1947, and the nature of the problems that a new nation has to solve. A lot of people said, you don't want to go into space. That's just not appropriate for you just yet. Focus on the more basics of dealing with poverty and education and healthcare. But there was a visionary, as most of these things are driven by, a guy called Vikram Sarabhai, who's largely recognized as the father of the Indian space program, who said, no, this is a way that a nation that's just making its way in the world can get to be industrialized, and should not necessarily go the way that other nations have gone through the process of industrialization. Just leapfrog some of the technologies, get onto the modern technologies, and the Prime Minister of the time really was very keen on that kind of approach, and that's what India did. So it had a space program very early on with the intention of getting a country industrialized in the shortest possible time and bring it up to speed with the existing Western countries. The militarization aspect was not considered at that time, but of course, just as it happened with the atomic weapons throughout the post-Second World War era, once one country got an atomic weapon, then its neighbors automatically thought of doing likewise. Mm-hmm. And so it was with India. When China got tested its atomic weapon in 1964, India pursued that route too. And then when China launched its satellites in the 1970s, India also wanted to make sure it kept up. And although initially it was to provide social and economic benefits to the country, the space program now does provide communication satellites for the Indian Navy, Army and Air Force. And in one respect, if I just mention one of the experiments that India conducted, it was in combination with the Indian Space Research Organization and the Department of Space, the Department of Research and Defense, DRDO, Department of Research and Defense Organization. It's the Department of Defense equivalent in the US. And it was an anti-satellite test that India conducted in March last year. ISRO placed a satellite in Earth orbit, low Earth orbit, and then about 2 months later, it launched a missile from India and destroyed it in Earth orbit. And the whole message behind that was to really reply to a test that China had conducted. It's again an ASAT, anti-satellite test that China conducted in 2007. So every country now is driven by the requirements of its military, and India is no different.
Mm-hmm. I'm speaking with Gurbir Singh about the Space Agency of India, past, present, and future. You can find him and his podcast at astrotalkuk.org and on Twitter at Gurbir Singh. If you like this podcast, please follow, like, and comment at spacewalksmoneytalks.com, on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, Spacewalks Money Talks, and on Twitter at SpacewalksMT. Now back to the podcast. Is India worried about the space debris issue much, or is that more of a problem of other countries with more satellites?
Well, every space nation, every nation that wants to invest in space should be worried about that. It was worried about the space debris. It didn't do a bad job. Didn't do a job as good as it said it was going to do. The space debris that resulted in last March test that India conducted was minimal, but it was there were some fragments that ended up at very high altitudes, and NASA and many of the other international players were not very happy with the results. There was, just like any nuclear test, people around the neighboring countries don't agree with that. But in the case of the debris from the test that India conducted in March, there were about 100 or so pieces that were left in Earth orbit, which India had anticipated from their simulations that wouldn't be there. They said that all the debris that came out of the test would be deorbited by itself within about 45 days. in effect. It took a lot longer, and about 24 pieces are still in low Earth orbit right now. So not minimal, but it is still an issue. And India, just like all other countries, wanted to send a message, which I think it was successful in doing.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, so just thinking about what you've told me so far about ISRO and how it controls the Indian space industry, it seems like this will keep them from getting into space tourism or space mining. It seems that private companies are leading those efforts, and that's not happening in India.
That's right. I think as you have in the US, the space law, a lot of the countries are now feeling it necessary to have some local national legislation, which defines the framework under which local companies, space companies, can operate. And until India does that, everything, I should say there are private companies operating in India already. There is a company that's produced and launched satellites, two satellites already. One of them was on board an Indian launcher, and the other one was through SpaceX. And it's an Indian private company that did it, Exceed Space. And although they've done this, I should also mention there's another private company that's been producing electric propulsion ion engines for spacecraft, based in India, and ISRO it's its only customer. So those private companies are operating on essentially what is a unique arrangement, a contract. In order for the private sector to flourish, they really do need to open up the legislation and define through legislation that's passed through Parliament what companies' obligations would be, what the national obligations would be should an Indian private sector company cause grief to some assets either in space or on Earth or belonging to another country. This is the kind of discussion that's being had in countries around the world, and I think the US has already got a Space Act in place. The way that company which might want to launch a spacecraft needs to get authorization for launching, getting clearance for airspace, getting insurance cover, getting the spectral bandwidth requirements through the legal process nationally as well as through the ITU. All of that has to have some mechanism, some instrument within a country that it can achieve on a more simplified way, rather than, for example, in the US you would have to go through the State Department and the FCC and many other government officials. Once it's organized, it can be brought down to just one point of contact to allow this. So in India, the space sector, the commercial space sector, space law has really held back the development of the space sector, but it is something that's been debated very heavily and loudly, and maybe later this year there will be some progress.
And this is sort of a related question, I'll maybe get back towards this issue. What are the major intellectual centers in India for space, either universities or think tanks or anything like that?
Well, it's quite an interesting question. In the US you have JPL, Ames, Goddard. India doesn't quite have something like that. It should have, it needs it, doesn't quite have something like that. Just about everything that does exist it comes under the ISRO control. ISRO has the space port in Sriharikota, which is on the east coast. On the west coast in Gujarat, there is the Space Applications Center, where most of the subsystems and applications are created, which end up in payloads for spacecraft. way down south in India is the Vikram Sarabhai Space Center, where a lot of the development of launch vehicles and rocket propellants are made. And indeed, there are liquid propulsion centers down in the south of India too. And one of the spacecraft I didn't mention is India has been developing for quite some time its own reusable spacecraft, or as it formally calls it, the Reusable Launch Vehicle Technology Demonstrator. About 5 years ago, it conducted its first flight. It's a very small, cut-down version in appearance to the space shuttle. It was, of course, unmanned, and it was launched from a solid booster up to a suborbital flight, and it made a simulated landing on the sea. It essentially crashed and wasn't not recovered, but it did perform and tested some of the key technologies required for a reusable space vehicle. That was built entirely at the Vikram Sarabhai Space Center. The second mission of that, in fact, should have taken place from an airdrop and a landing on a runway last December. That didn't happen, but it's going to be hopefully happening in the next few months of the first half of this year. One of the other centres I should mention is up in the north in the state of Punjab. There's this semiconductor fabrication facility where a lot of the semiconductor and integrated circuits used in spacecraft control are constructed.
Mm-hmm. And I asked the question because, at least in the U.S., it seems that where you have the intellectual centers, you start to have small companies grow around them, either because the people trained in these centers, stay locally and, they network and they have the access to skills there, or companies move close to these centers for the same reasons. And I was just wondering if India had anything close to that.
That's quite interesting. Is it Route 66 that you have up near MIT? This is the kind of, or the Silicon Valley of today, is the sort of thing that Vikram Sarabhai tried to set up in the 1960s when the space program was first launched. So the answer, I suppose, the nearest equivalent would be Bangalore. And Bangalore has always, for many years, has been a center for one of the larger companies there. It's called the Bangalore Electronics Limited, which is one of the reasons. It's a very large concern, a bit like General Electrics, I guess, of the US. And also in Bangalore is the Indian Institute for Science, which is where a lot of the innovation and technical development takes place. And some of the companies, one of the companies I mentioned in India, called Bellatrix, that develops the ion engines for spacecraft, is founded in association with the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. Also in Bangalore is the company that is mostly a defense organization. It's called the Hindustan Air Limited, where aircraft are developed, and the Indians' small fighter trainers are developed. So it's a lot of concentration of electronics, aviation, and technical innovation coming out of academic institutions in Bangalore.
Mm-hmm. Now, does previously I mentioned how many engineers India has, but let me ask: does India feel as though maybe it needs more engineers? Is there a dearth? Is there more than maybe they can absorb? Are there any initiatives to increase aerospace engineering in India?
Well, I can only give you my personal view and speculation on this. Mm-hmm. Indian engineers and scientists are really good at what they do. A lot of them have been working outside India for many years. And, one of the things that you'll hear about the Indian space program is this, that India does everything on the cheap. And if you want, fair enough, competition is bringing prices down right around the world anyway. Mm-hmm. But the Indian space program has been, I think, emphasizing its frugality too much. Sure, prices should be low and it should be competitive, but India's quality of what they do is really high. For example, the spacecraft that went to Mars in 2013 was India's very first attempt at something so far away. And now that we're about 7 years on, it's still in Martian orbit and operating. It's technologically, it's a spectacular success. So there is a huge deal of talent in India. Unfortunately, part of the problem I was referring to earlier, the frustration in working in a very tight government organizational environment, engineers and scientists don't choose to stay there. And I suspect, and here's my speculation, on the one hand, ISRO wants to keep the prices low, so they want to have engineers and not pay them very much, which is just what you need in order to get those engineers to think about working elsewhere. Mm-hmm. Now, fortunately, India has a very large population and a very large young population, so they will find engineers to work in ISRO. But I suspect that after a while, the ISRO will lose the most talented individuals because of the working environment in which ISRO operates. So unless they change that and make it attractive and increase the salaries and increase the training for those individuals, the talented individuals will leave India, and there will be something in the way of a brain drain. Mm-hmm. That's something that every space agency has to look out for, but particularly India, because I think the talent that India has in this respect is huge, and it would be pity to see India trying to keep prices low and losing out on that talent if it chose to do that.
Mm-hmm. For some reason, I don't know why, but just as you were talking, it popped in my head that India maybe has the, I don't want to say unique capability, but an opportunity to lead the way in space mining. If you think about it as, if space mining were an automated, endeavor where you didn't have to send manned craft out there. You create a technologically advanced, spacecraft and mining device and, send it out and that sort of thing. For some reason, India seems like it would be a good country to develop that industry because of low costs, maybe. Yes, the engineers aren't getting paid as much, but if the costs are low, maybe they could be ahead of the curve.
And that's true not just for space mining, but so many other areas. Unfortunately, I don't think that's a very commercially driven goal. Mm-hmm. And currently, the commercially driven goals are not getting the government support, or they don't have the freedom, the legislative freedom under which they can do this kind of thing. America is far better placed than that, and China has, since about 3-4 years, the government there has given Chinese private sector companies much more freedom, and they are making some headway, unlike India. So although in principle you're right, I agree, India could do a lot more in that respect. Unfortunately, I don't think the private sector in India, which is where the lead would come from, has got that capacity. Certainly hasn't got it yet.
Mm-hmm. And I say that because I feel like India has the benefit of maybe lower costs than the U.S., greater freedom of expression and exchange of ideas than maybe China would have. But then you have this government restriction. I think if India had loosens things up commercially, I feel like it has a nice confluence of capabilities. But as you say, the environment doesn't exist right now.
Yeah, and I think it is quite an advanced technology. Asteroid mining is not something that anybody's really engaged in just yet in terms of specific missions.
Mm-hmm.
But given 5 years from now, what you're saying is exactly right, and India could be at the lead if it was all set up to do so. I should also mention that just like China, India has seen great economic development for the last decade or so. But right now, both India and China, the economy is not growing as it used to. The trade problems that the US has had with China has also held back the Chinese economy. There's various reasons why the Indian economy slowed down. And it's ironic because the space economy, throughout all of this time, is actually doing really well. And that's an area that government should focus because of that reason.
Mm-hmm. Tell me, what excites you about space, personally?
Well, I'll go out on a limb. I'll usually find, apart from the technological achievements and the innovations that take place in space, quite riveting. What I find is, I think beyond nationalistic goals, although ironically is the nationalistic and political goals that drive space, that we humans on Earth have a future in space. And if you, like you, I'm also a fan of sci-fi, and I see our future, our collective human future, in space and in other parts of the solar system and beyond. And it's through the close interaction of the collaboration that takes place between multiple countries, with the International Space Station right now, for example, which has been a huge technological success, scientific success, and also, I think above all, it's been a success in politics, in bringing and keeping countries together. I remember about 3 or 4 years ago when the relationships between US and Russia were not going very well, and President Putin saying, "Oh yes, things may not be going very well down here, but up in space we're collaborating like brothers and sisters." And that bringing together of people through the media of space, if you like, is a thing that not only excites me but gives me hope for our collective future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. So where can people find you on the web, social media, website, your podcast?
Okay, so if you just look for Gurbir Singh Astronomy in Google, you'd find something. But my podcast is called Astro Talk UK, and the web address, and just has one dot in it, is astrotalkuk.org. Mm-hmm. And that have all the information. And I'm also on Twitter at Gurbir Singh.
Okay. And I'll spell that for listeners, GURBIRSINGH, Gurbir Singh.
And you say that so well, Chris.
All right. So that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
Yeah, just to say that India's space program is very unusual compared to the other countries. Particularly its focus on social and economic development for its initial founding. And the initial founders would be quite impressed with the way that it has gone so far. One of the things that made India unique in the evolution of its space program was the people who set up the conditions very early on. And one of the, in fact, the very first Prime Minister of India was Nehru, who, despite his religious beliefs, and India has a very long history of spiritual and religion going back centuries and thousands of years. But when Nehru became the president, the prime minister of the independent India in 1947, he captured something in the Indian constitution that he thought was so important, and he captured what he called the scientific temper. And the Article 51A of the Indian constitution says that it requires that every Indian citizen shall develop a scientific temper, humanism, and a spirit of inquiry and reform. And that shift from a spiritual India to a more scientific India, I think, is at the heart of its space program, but indeed many other scientific institutions too. And through that combination, I think India has not only done well for itself, but has shown the rest of the world the way that we can integrate both life here on Earth and in space.
I agree. I think a lot of countries could stand to apply that sort of thinking. So yeah, thank you very much for speaking with me.
You're welcome. It's great fun.
Thank you for listening. You can find more podcasts like this on your favorite podcast feed under the title Spacewalks Money Talks. That includes Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. One great way to support me is to rate my podcasts, either good or bad. You can find more fascinating information at spacewalksmoneytalks.com, on YouTube under Spacewalks Money Talks, on Facebook under Spacewalks Money Talks, on Instagram under Spacewalks Money Talks, and on Twitter at SpacewalksMT. Don't forget to sign up for my weekly newsletter where I recommend newly published books. The subscription box is on my webpage. Thank you for listening.